Interlude, a growing fear. Heirloon Island was the furthest out to sea of all the Havamirian islands. It took less than half a day's walk to go round the whole of it, and in some places it grew so narrow that one could throw a stone from one shore to another. A large outcrop arose from the northern tip of the island, and on top of that outcrop stood the ruins of a great stone house. Even though the dome roof had long caved in and one of its walls had fallen over, the ruined house was the pride of the people who lived on Heirloon, for it had once belonged to the great hero Mir. It was so sacred to the people that they would only approach it on certain celebrations throughout the year. Even so, there was a wreckman named Narrator who did not have the same reverence as his fellow islanders. He had no house of his own, so he lived in the ruins of Mir's house. The islanders had beaten him many times for this, but he kept returning to the ruins. It was finally resolved that they would leave Narrator be and let Ahatho judge him at the end of his life. It was well known among the Heirloon Islanders that Narrator was a lazy man, and that any coins lent to him had just as much chance of returning to the lender as coins tossed into the sea. When people saw him strolling down the paths, they would pretend not to see him, or they would walk away because they knew he would have a new story as to why he needed money, and why he could not get it on his own. He would moan about how the Ulevins had forsaken his family, or how he had grown ill from the cold night winds. Unlike so many men on Heirloon, he did not have a boat or net, and neither did he go out to fish as crew on another man's boat. He preferred to sit in the shade of hurricane trees, or wander around the island from hut to hut like a stray jag. His philosophy had been that some men made a living off of their own sweat, while some men made a living off of the charity of others. He believed that both were respectable means of survival. His thinking had earned him no possessions and a home in the old ruins. Despite all of the things he lacked, the one thing he did have was knowledge of everyone's business. If Narrator was the laziest man on the island, Ehredt was the most industrious. He was the first fisherman to take his boat out in the evening and the last to pull his prow up onto the beach in the morning. When he was not fishing, he was repairing his nets or improving his compound. His wife had given him many children, and she always found a way to put a full bull in front of each of them at mealtimes. Everyone knew that Ehredt's children were well behaved, but if they did fall into mischief, Ehredt's firm hand would be waiting for them at home. Ehredt would not tolerate laziness, and Narrator seemed to take a roguish pleasure in knowing that his mere presence strongly irritated the hard-working fisherman. One day at noon, Ehredt was in his compound running a whetstone across the head of an old spear. Next to him was another pair of spears and half a dozen knives that needed sharpening. Ehredt glanced up from his work to see Narrator coming down the path. Ehredt grunted and continued to work on his spear. Narrator grinned as he hung his lanky arms over the compound's short wall, right near the compound's pit where the croaks wallowed in the mud and dug for worms. "Good noon, Ehredt." "What do you want?" the fisherman asked, curtly, not taking his eyes from his work. Narrator was not discouraged. "I see you put new thatch on your hut. That is certainly a job that keeps your back to the sun." Ehredt nodded, thinking to himself that Narrator never knew how work like that really felt. "But in 3 years," Narrator continued, "you'll have to do it all over again, possibly 2 if the weather is bad. It makes a job feel empty." "What do you want, Narrator?" "I would only like to know what drives a man to work so hard when the result of his labour will eventually fall into decay. Does it bring that man pleasure?" "If you're looking for an answer to that question, ask another man. I'm too busy for such talk." "What are you doing, then?" Narrator asked, nodding in the direction of the spears and knives. "It looks like grudge work." "For someone who has a storehouse of rumours, I'm surprised you do not know. A new danger has come, and I do not want to be unprepared." "Oh, you speak of the Legender. Yes, I've heard of him. I too attend the elders' speeches. But your spears and knives will not protect you. The Legender has more power than a sharp edge." "What kind of power?" Ehredt asked. He immediately felt ashamed for sounding interested in what Narabo had to say, but kept his face as stern as he could. "He brought Tierian's walls down on Halorith's neck. I have heard about this." The silence that followed may have been the only moment in these two men's lives when there was a shred of unity between them. They had a common enemy, Halorith's murderer, and they both dwelled on thoughts of how this legender was an evil to Havamir. "Your weapons cannot protect you from such a power," said Narabo at length. "The legender can make your whole house fall in on your family as you sleep. What good would a roof be then? I'm fortunate in this, for the roof of my house has already fallen. Do not speak such wicked things over my wall. Do you wish to curse my family? Get away and do not come back until you've traded your idleness for wisdom." Narabo backed away, letting his lanky arms slide off the short wall and swing to his side. He then walked down the path to put his elbows on another wall and discover rumours from another house. Ehredt rubbed the whetstone hard against the spearhead, hoping it would calm his anger. Even though Narabo had found a way to prod his temper, there was truth in what the lowly Reckman had said. Ehredt knew something had to be done about the legender so that his family would be safe. He resolved to have a word with the elders of the island. Chapter 10. Tarakasti. There came the smell of salt on the wind long before the sea came into view. Not a strong scent, but just enough of a hint on the breeze that those who so greatly longed for their home on the coast could sense it. Talk of the North Road ending and home arriving rippled through the caravan, and as the travellers crested the top of a particularly tall hill, they saw their instincts proven true. There lay the great dark blue, a blue that stretched beyond the corners of sight, a blue speckled with green islands and white foam. Hundreds of full clouds sailed above, casting their shadows on the water, and thousands of seabirds floated on the wind. It was the Talapika Ocean, the vast water that wrapped around Havamir and spread out north to the unknown. The land grew sandier as it neared the Talapika, and areas of hardwoods gradually gave way to groves of hurricane trees and hills covered in dune grass. All along the coast stood immense outcroppings of rock that jutted into the sea like great petrified ships. In between them, smooth white dunes rose and fell and spilled their sand into the breakers. Upon the largest of the rock outcroppings perched the city of Tarakasti, the capital of Havamir. It was early afternoon when messengers came down the road bearing news that the Queen's caravan drew near. The news brought people out of their homes and shops and their market stalls by the harbour, and they began to gather by the city gate to see the caravan's arrival. Though the sun shone brightly, it brought little warmth, for a cold and powerful wind blew off the sea and roared in the ears. Those of Tarakasti, however, were accustomed to the ocean's autumn and winter wind. They called the wind the Lovo, for it howled and howled. The people weathered the gusts as they gathered outside the city. Fishers and Lowens took their place on the fringes of the crowd, while the Trishans stood towards the centre. A group of old Trishan men sat on stools in front of the crowd. Their Tirek-hide cloaks bore the insignia of the skyle, a fish that symbolized wisdom, for it was skilled in evading fishermen's nets. The insignia showed that the men were reins on the council of the mast. While the city waited for the caravan to arrive, a group of Lowen children played on the road by the gate, throwing pebbles at circles they had drawn in the dust. They cheered each time the pebbles landed in the circles and ran to retrieve what they had thrown. But then they suddenly yelped with fear and ran to their mothers. The Lowen women took up their children and turned to see what had caused the fright. Out from the opening of the city gate there came a tall, gaunt woman deep in a trance, her eyes staring ahead into nothing. She carried a jar with smouldering lithy inside and deeply breathed the entrancing smoke that came from the jar's mouth. Despite the cold, she walked barefoot and wore a rough garment that did not cover her arms or neck. It was made entirely out of woven kelp and had seashells and bird skulls dangling from it. The bottom edge dragged across the road as she passed, and it swept away the children's pebbles and circles in the dust. All, whether Tritian or Lowen, made way for her, and all talk was stilled in her presence. It was only until after she left the crowd that people resumed their talk with one another. The woman walked slowly down the road, pausing at times to smell the wind. When she had gone 40 paces away from the city, she stopped in the middle of the road and waited. Not long afterwards, the caravan crested a hill and came into view. A loud horn blast sounded from the city's walls, and all in the crowd looked to the road. The drums pounded in the caravan, and the soldiers held their spears and banners high as they approached Terekaste. The entire caravan marched with fervour, for home was near and their families awaited them. But all of it came to a halt when the front column of soldiers reached the spot on the road where the lone woman stood. She did not acknowledge them, but stared blankly ahead as if the road were empty of people. The soldiers diverted their eyes from her gaze. Maris came down from her howdah seat and walked to the front of the caravan, the soldiers parting for her. She came to stand before the lone woman, but the lone woman neither bowed to her nor handed her a speaking totem. The wind blew the lithy smoke from the mouth of the jar into Maris's face. The smoke had the smell of dead reptiles. Maris did not flinch at it, for if the people saw their queen disturbed by such things, they would take it as a sign of weakness. Neither did Maris look to the ground like the others, but stared at the woman's face, the chin, the nose, the forehead, everywhere but the eyes. It was a face like a wood-carving worn away by years of sun and rain, and it was the lack of features that made the woman's age hard to place. In one moment she was a crone, and in the next she was a youth. "Who comes down this road?" she said in a disembodied voice. Though the glassy stare unnerved her, Maris managed to speak with the sense of ceremony required. "Hear me, Mania, and let us pass. I, your queen, come down this road." "Do your spears and lances point at the city, or do they point to the sky?" "See that we are at peace with you. Our spears and lances point to the sky." The Mania slowly waved her hand through the lithy smoke, the seashells and bird skulls on her garment rattling together as she did so. Then she began muttering the old language of the Elamari. Maris understood some of what she said, but the words that sounded harsh and dark were out of her knowledge. It seemed to Maris that wind grew colder and more penetrating as the Mania chanted. When the chanting stopped, the woman brought her head out of the smoke and pointed a bony finger at Maris. "The Ulevans demand a sacrifice for your passage," the Mania said at last. Her finger then pointed at Maris's wrist. "They demand the cord that is tied there." Maris clutched her wrist tightly to her chest. "But why, good Mania, would they want such a humble thing?" "It is not for you, a mere girl, to question the Ulevans." "But what of my gems and fine robes? Would those not be worthier treasures?" "Is there mud in your ears? Have you not heard what I have said? Silence these foolish questions, and give the Ulevans what they demand." "Grant me a word more, good Mania, and hear my plea." Maris's voice shook with desperation. "The cord on my wrist binds me to our fallen Halorith. I promised him as he lay in his grave that I would wear it for as long as I live. Surely the Ulevans would understand such a promise." "The Ulevans are never uncertain of what they demand. They know the value of what they ask. Give them the cord! Although Maris tried to keep her rigid composure, the colour began to leave her cheeks and her breathing grew shallower. Gripped by uncertainty, she did not move, but held her wrist tightly to her chest as though the Menhir would rip the cord from her at any moment. The Menhir made no such motion, but grew impatient and turned to face the city. "This is your queen!" she screamed. Her voice was so strong that it could be heard through the howling wind and heard by all gathered by the city gate. The Menhir then returned to face the caravan. "This is your queen who will not pay your toll!" Maris winced as though she had taken a blow from a whip, and then quickly untied the cord from her wrist even as her tears began to well up. With a limp arm she relinquished the cord over to the Menhir, who eagerly snatched it up and put it in her jar of smouldering lithy. As it was burning, she breathed in the smoke greedily. "The Ulevans find your sacrifice acceptable," she hissed. The Menhir then stepped off to the side of the road and bowed her head. Once again there came a horn blast from the city wall. The caravan replied by ringing Mahala's bell. The tolls should have brought forth a proud cheer from the people of Terakasti, but all knew what had happened to Hallerith during the flight. Therefore the bells sounded out in lament, and no happy fanfare greeted the caravan as they entered the city. Terakasti was a city of domed roofs, of walls made up of rounded stones. Shells had been placed in the mortar, and sea creatures inhabited the woodwork. There were long-finned fish, tyrix of blubbery shape, and sleek-furred saneas, all in relief around doorways, and carvings of the Vertugas with their paddle tails and rounded shells lay at the bases of the pillars. The largest and grandest of the buildings in Terakasti was Stoneprow, the dwelling of kings. It was the crown of the city set upon the tip of the pointed outcropping. Most of Stoneprow had been carved straight from the cliff where it stood, and it resembled a ship pointed out to sea. A tower rose from the middle like a mast and served as a beacon to the harbours below. A vast blue banner, embroidered with the rising sun, flew from the top of the tower, a sign of welcome to the coming queen. During the long journey from Tierian, Maris had imagined her arrival home as more of a joyous occasion, but as her Indramon took her through the city and as she neared Stoneprow, she appeared crestfallen, and her fingers rubbed the place on her wrist where the cord had once been. East of Terakasti, Arcos sat on the edge of a cliff that protruded out into the ocean. He was close enough to the city that it was within sight, but far enough away from the business of humankind. Below Arcos, the sea churned wildly as the waves crashed against the cliff. The great black rocks at the base, each armoured with 1,000 razor mollusks, staunchly endured the turbulent waters. In one moment the rocks would lay fully exposed to the air, but only as the waves receded and gathered strength. Then the sea would heave its weight into the cliff, crashing into foam and drowning the rocks completely. At a slow yet constant rhythm, rock and sea did battle with one another. The winds danced about blithely above, unconcerned with the fight below them. Within their powerful gusts flew sea-birds of all kinds, birds coming from beyond the horizon where they had spent the day hunting for fish out in deeper waters. The winds laughed excitedly as they carried the birds aloft, and Arcos thought that the sound was not much different than the laughter of young children as they pulled the strings on their kites. Arcos interrupted the games and spoke to the winds, asking them to deliver a message. "Find the legenders on the island of Avonshaw. Tell them that I am still alive and that I long to hear from them." The blue stone, sitting at Arcos's side, saw only futility in asking the winds such a favour, and reminded Arcos that the winds were capricious beings, quick to forget a task once a new game presented itself. There were the countless messages that Arcos had sent by wind from Tierion to Avonshore, messages that never yielded reply. Though being in Havamere brought Arcos closer to Avonshore, the stone believed that any message would be forgotten once the winds travelled beyond the hunting waters of the birds. "What you say may be true," Arcos replied, "but I still must try. The sea says that she has heard nothing from that island. I must then try with the winds. Perhaps they can go farther into Avonshore's inland and learn of what the ocean cannot sense." Arcos continued to speak with each gust as it passed, but as the evening neared he spoke less and less. At sunset he was quiet and became entranced by what he witnessed. 1,000 years had passed since he had last seen gold and scarlet reflected on the vast ocean, since he had last seen the sun sink into the watery horizon, turning into a glowing island before it disappeared. Arcos watched as one in a dream, and he kept his silence long after the gloaming and darkening of the sky. "This is how a free man must feel," he said at last. The Bluestone wondered at this, for freedom was something it did not comprehend. It did not understand why the winds would not hold still and find peace in where they were, nor did it entirely know why Arcos had desired to leave Tierion. A good resting place, the stone thought, was the greatest thing one could have. It had found its resting place in the pouch on Arcos's belt, and even that was considered an unusual preference to those of the earthen kind. Over the ocean, the stars came out one at a time, then by the dozens, then the hundreds and thousands. The constellation of Avaleo shone in the northern portion of the sky. Avaleo, the heavenly being known as the Hand of Ahatho, was depicted with his sword, the earth edge of dawn raised high above him. Constellations of the Urin, the beasts of elements, encircled him and were poised to fight. For Arcos, the hours passed in quiet star-watching and meditation, as the sky turned on its hidden axis. It was not until the constellations of Avaleo and the Erderin fell under the edge of the horizon that his solitude was disturbed. The murmuring of the waves was tinged with the frenetic baying of jags. It was a steadily growing noise, one that grew nearer and more feverish by the moment. From it, Arcos could tell that the jags were closing in on whatever it was they hunted. He broke from his vigil and turned to look inland. There he saw 3 lights swiftly racing across the dunes, torches held by the hunters who followed the noise. The lights were coming his way. The hunting pack, nearly 20 strong, was the first to reach Arcos. The jags barked and snapped their jaws, but none of them dared to lunge at him. Arcos merely stood at the cliff's edge and worked his gaze over the pack. Whenever he met the look of a yellow eye, the jag would turn its head to the ground or whimper and retreat to the rear. A company of soldiers, a dozen men clad in grey cloaks and grey armour, followed soon after. They rode upon ganders, not the deft and graceful breed Arcos had seen in the caravan, but the heavy and brawny kind used for war. The hooves thundered against the rocky ground as they galloped up to where Arcos stood, and when the soldiers pulled in the reins, the ganders snorted angrily, sending puffs of steam into the air. 3 of the soldiers held torches, but the others were armed with spears, which they quickly pointed at Arcos's chest. These were not the soldiers of the caravan, those who had seen Arcos slay the Harguars, but sharp-faced men who guarded the city and its surrounding lands. In the torchlight, their brows and jaws appeared hardened, and they regarded Arcos with wary looks as if he were a criminal, glancing often at the sabres he carried sheathed at his sides. "Are you the legender?" asked the leader of the company, the soldier with a feather in his helm. Arcos nodded. "We bear a command from the Council of the Mast. You're to come with us to Terracaste." Arcos looked at the soldier and considered him with disappointment. "I'm to be your prisoner." Arcos nodded grimly, and then continued, "There is no need for spears. I'm under Havamir's command. If the people who sent you had summoned me, I would have come to them of my own accord. Even now I will go without resistance." Arcos left his place by the cliff's edge, and the jags backed away from him, some with their tails tucked between their legs. Even the heavy-hooved ganders parted before him. He left the rocky outcrop that formed the cliff and began walking the sandy ground towards Terracaste. Despite what he had told the soldiers, they rode behind him at a close distance and kept their spears pointed at his back.